All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Kat Lloyd. I work here at the Tenement Museum as the Vice President of Programs. It is such an honor to be here with all of you in person and with Qian Julie Wang. I've already talked to quite a few of you, how excited you are for this book. And I see some familiar faces, so many of you know that the Tenement Museum every day we share the stories of immigrants, migrants, refugees through our recreated apartment exhibits to really connect past to present and help build a more inclusive society. And so these talks, which actually it's been quite a while since we've gotten to be in person in this space with a group for a conversation with an author. So it's been really exciting. We've been doing live streams. Maybe some of you have watched those. But these public programs are chances for us to extend, right, what we don't always have time for in our hour-long tours and really think about how the stories that we share, you know, of 150 years of New York City history, how do those stories extend to today, and how can we be thinking about how our stories are connected to the stories of New York City now. So I'm so excited to be in conversation with Qian Julie Wang tonight. And, you know, I think you first came to the museum a few years ago. Did we decide it was 2022, maybe? And the first program that we did together was in the recreated Wang family exhibit that you'll see. Some of you have tickets for mini tours. You'll get to see sort of the space that we've recreated to tell the story of Mrs. Wang, Mr. Wang, and their 4 children. Here we see Mrs. Wang and their oldest daughter, Yatping, who moved to New York City from Hong Kong in 1965. And Yatping was actually, she was 7, so around the same age, right, as when you came here. And, you know, we share their story of arriving in the 1960s when the Chinese community was just finally able to grow after decades and decades of the impact of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and how the Wangs are here at this moment of Chinatown really transforming, right, and becoming, starting to become the Chinatown that it is today. And so we have a recreated garment factory upstairs that you'll get to experience, where we share the stories of Mrs. Wang and women like Mrs. Wang, who worked in the garment industry for their careers. Mrs. Wang worked in the garment industry starting in the 1970s, right? Part of this shift in the garment industry. And when you first came to the exhibit, you know, I feel like there was so many connections to what you write about in your book about your childhood and sort of the way that this exhibit resonated with you. So I think to start us out, and because I know we have some folks who haven't read the book yet, but you have your copies, so you'll read it after tonight. But if you could just start us out telling us a little bit about sort of the premise of the book, and then kind of what was your experience seeing this garment factory exhibit? Sort of how did this resonate with you?
Thank you all for being here with me. I really do appreciate it, especially in the rain. My book is my memoir about having moved here at age 7 in 1994 and becoming pretty quickly undocumented with my parents. I really tried to inhabit the emotional and personal experience of going from being a fairly privileged child in North China. I was born just outside of Beijing in a city called Shijiazhuang, to living in Brooklyn, commuting in Chinatown for school, accompanying my mom to work at the sweatshops, my mother who had been a computer science professor, and my father who had been an English professor, were relegated to manual labor because of status. And realizing overnight what it meant to have privilege and what it meant to not have privilege. I would spend the next 5 years hungry. I would go to school without breakfast and scramble to learn English and mostly keep my head down so that we would not be found out and be deported. So it took me a long time, we'll talk about this later, to kind of process all these memories and bring this memoir into reality. But when I was on my book tour, I had the very good fortune of doing an event here. And when I saw the exhibit, I felt like I had traveled in time. I felt like it's a smaller replica, of course, but the details are so accurate to where my mother worked and where we spent 12, 16 hours at a time. The little rice cooker, when my eyes landed on that, because we got free rice at the sweatshop and I would look forward to it, I teared up. I have never been so emotionally affected by a museum exhibit. It truly felt like someone had kind of reached into the recesses of my memory and created a room. And I felt so seen and so recognized and safe, ironically enough. So I can't thank the staff of this museum enough for all of their hard, priceless work that they're doing every single day. I want to give a shout out to all of you for you're changing the world. Thank you.
Well, I mean, and truly you are too, right? We'll talk about this throughout the conversation, but just the power and importance of sharing these stories and these memories that you accessed. That's, you know, we think about that every day at the museum, right? How do you share a family history where so many of those stories that we're sharing are from times when these families' experiences were incredibly difficult, right? And how do people respond to the conditions they're in? And how do we help our visitors sort of understand these experiences that happen through, you know, immigration? And so, yes, I feel like we'll get back to this at the end of like how amazing your work is and our work is and the big love fest of how important all of this is. But so, you know, you've talked a lot about sort of what prompted you to actually write this book and how you sort of got to the place where you could access these memories. But it's been almost 10 years, right, since that moment. It's hard to believe that 2016 was almost 10 years ago. But it's been almost 10 years since sort of that moment when you reflected on, like, it's time to tell this story. So I'm curious, like, how do you think about that decision now that it's been 10 years, right? Have you thought about it differently at all?
I'm definitely glad I pushed through with it, but I say to all of my fellow authors, I'm so fortunate that I didn't know anything about publishing. When I decided to publish a memoir as my debut, it's so insanely personal and it's so vulnerable, and you're just kind of putting your heart out on the shelf for people to dissect and criticize and reject, and it takes really thick skin to do that. And I've developed that thick skin, thankfully, not by choice. No, I'm very, very grateful. I think my tour, especially across America, made me realize how many children and young people and adults are still living in that space. And by that space, I don't just necessarily mean that undocumented space, although that is definitely true. It's that space of fear, that space of feeling captive to your early life traumas, that space of not knowing how to reclaim yourself and your identity from something that happened to you when you felt so out of control and so deeply vulnerable. I got to know so many people face to face who, if you looked at a distance on the political spectrum, we may have absolutely nothing in common, but we share, you know, that longing for free rice. We share that longing for the Polly Pockets I found in the trash because I couldn't afford toys. We share the love for the Babysitters Club and Sweet Valley Twins. And I think that speaking heart to heart these days, especially in where we are right now in America, is the thing that we need most, and we need to continue doing it. It is an act of resistance to continue loving each other, no matter the labels, no matter might judge from the surface.
Yeah, right. And thinking about just, where we've come from since 2016 and realizing, how crucial it is to find those universal points of connection and honor that in the specific, right, in all those details that you share can be these moments of universal, right? That's something we think about a lot at the museum when we're sharing these stories of families and communities that our visitors might not be part of, right? How do you tell a big story in a way that helps people make those connections? And I feel like, the way you write is so powerful and in such a way that people who share parts of that experience, I imagine, can feel connected, as you've talked about, and then people like me, right, who I'm like 4 generations removed from my immigrant ancestors, can find those moments of connection in the way that you write. And I'm always incredibly impressed to think about you writing this book on the subway. You talk a lot about how you wrote this book kind of in your notes app is where it started, right? On the subway. And how, yeah, you're of course fitting in the writing with a full-time career as a civil rights lawyer. But, you know, in thinking about the writing process, you know, what was the sort of first memory that you accessed and wrote about?
Yeah, I think to access all of these memories and be able to render them on the page authentically, I had to remove all filters and self-censorship. And somehow the subway allowed me to do that on my phone because it felt very casual. Felt like no one's ever going to read the silly thing I'm making in the notes app. There's no way I can take it seriously. And I think for me, I had grown up spending so much time on the subway. That was where I was reading the Bates, where I was spending hours of my day going to and from school. But your question was, like,
just thinking about like what was the first memory? Because you kind of have talked about how you know, this is a part of your life that it took some time to figure out how to process it, and then of course the next step of actually writing about it and sharing. So just curious, sort of what came to mind first when you finally like opened that notes app and were ready to write.
So the hard memories were really hard to access. I saved some of the most difficult scenes for I did not write chronologically. I wrote whatever came most present to me in that moment. And so the easiest scene were the helpful, joyful ones. So finding the Polly Pocket in the trash. So it felt like magic. I saw my friends playing with Polly Pockets. I saw Polly Pockets on commercials, and I was like, I live in New York City. This is a pretty wealthy city. I'm just gonna walk around with my eyes in the gutter, and one day I will find one Polly Pocket. I am determined. And one day I did. I did not just find one. I found a whole bag of them in like one of those stoop giveaways, like 5 different ones, some that I hadn't even seen of commercials of. And it just felt like someone up there was like, keep doing what you're doing. There's someone listening, you know, 1 in 10, you know, you may have been staring at the gutters for weeks, but it does reward you every now and then. And it just felt like one of those times when, you know, you're a kid and you're so alone and you feel like no one understands you and you're out of control. Felt like something bigger was kind of understanding me in those small slivers of moments. And I wanted to capture that as much as I wanted to capture the dark times, the difficult times where my parents were just living in constant fear the minute they stepped out of the door, and where I was accused of plagiarism by my teacher by virtue of my race. There were some very difficult moments as well. But I think unlocking that joy that I still was able to hold on to, because no childhood is just all darkness. There's still those glimmers. I think unlocking those portals made me feel safe enough to then go deeper and find the darker memories and revisit them.
Yeah, and then it is, right, thinking about what are the access points to these memories. And, you know, we talk a lot about, you know, at the museum of how do stories pass down through generations, right? And, you know, you're writing at this sort of unique moment of looking at your childhood, writing about sort of your youth. And you start when you were age 7, right? And right up until you were about, where does the book leave off? Like 12, 13, right? So you're writing about this like incredibly formative period of your childhood. And, you know, that we at the museum have been talking about, you know, the stories that tend to pass down over generations are the happy stories, right? The stories that are joyful or, you know, share about our family's strength and resilience and how our family has changed over time. But something else we've been thinking a lot about, there's a sociologist, Marshall Duke, who did a lot of research on sort of resilience in children as connected to family history that the children know. And what he found in his research, that actually children who know about sort of the ups and downs of their family's experience, who know not only the joyful, happy moments, but also the moments where things were bleak, were dark, were fearful, that those children, knowing about the ups and downs, ultimately are more resilient for it. So I was curious your thoughts on that idea. Like, does that resonate with you? Yeah, just
1,000%. Yeah, I mean, I've spent a lot of time in therapy. I continue to spend a lot of time in therapy. And my therapist says, now that I have a child and I'm worried about making colossal, irreversible mistakes that damage her permanently, she says it's not about what the child experiences necessarily. Of course, you want to protect them from the really horrific stuff. It's about how you process it with them. Essentially, it's about how you do therapy with them, right? Are they able to reclaim their identity and their sense of power from that experience? Are they able to map it onto a sense of belonging and ownership? Are they able to trace it to your experience of yourself? This actually clicked for me more recently in a very specific context. So after I gave birth to my daughter, during the last few weeks of pregnancy, I had preeclampsia, and I had very low milk supply. And I, like a lot of young mothers, beat myself up and worked around the clock, did this crazy thing called triple feeding, where I was pumping and feeding and nursing, and nothing was working. And I just felt so damaged and out of control, and like the very first thing in my daughter's life I could not give her. And my dad told me, it was weird because it came out of nowhere. I never thought about breastfeeding. It wasn't particularly important to me. But one day my dad told me that he was born during the Great Famine. And his mother, my grandmother, had no milk because she had nothing to eat. She had no milk to give him, and so she made millet porridge and fed him mostly the water from the porridge. That this legacy of famine and starvation and inability to provide is not just in me because of me, but because it's generational, and that I'm connected to her in this way. And in that way, I stopped kind of judging my feelings and shaming myself and saying, like, this is my grandmother's. Like, she wanted badly to feed her children just as I do, and it's natural for me to feel this way, and it's natural for me, my body, to say I can't give. Like, right now, we're just not in a position to give, and own that and understand that it comes from a place of love and do what the child needs. But there are these little experiences where I'm able to map myself onto my parents' experiences that give me so much more meaning and sense of collective belonging. That's why my book opens not with my story, but with my father's childhood memory. I very secretly interviewed him. He didn't know that this book was gonna be published. But I asked him very pointed questions to get these memories out of him. And in even those snapshots, I saw myself. And that's how we, understand our legacy and what we're called upon by the world to bring, like what our ancestors have left behind for us.
Yeah, I mean, goodness, this is sparking so many of the other questions that I wanted to ask you about multi-generational and sort of transgenerational experiences and memories, and absolutely thinking about, right, how we embody the legacies of our ancestors, whether or not we think about that, right? And then what are the invitations we have, or the sparks, or those moments where we are then connecting to, oh, maybe this is because of my ancestors. But I was really struck too by and makes sense now, maybe thinking about you interviewing your father for that opening chapter, but just how you're able to write about your parents' experiences and sort of perspectives through your perspective as a child, where, we're able to see both the sort of the way in which, as children, we look at our parents, right, and try to figure them out, but also don't know them as full people. And you capture sort of that childlike way of looking at our parents, but then also I really saw how you were able to then, represent them as full people as well. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the process of what was it like sort of writing the experience of your parents.
It was really healing. I think as a child, living as a child, you're not able to see your parents clearly because you're forever kind of looking up at them. But that dynamic gets complicated when your parents are put in a position where they can't necessarily provide for you, whether because they're dealing with illness or addiction or immigration or poverty. and the roles kind of flip, but you're still kind of looking up at them for cues. And part of the mission of this memoir and this project was I wanted to go back and revisit who my parents were at the time, really hold them up to the light for myself and for the world, how much they really tried. And yes, they failed in a lot of ways, but they kept trying. So be able to hold those people that they had been, see them through that childhood lens, but also for myself and my own healing, see them as an adult. Because when I wrote this, I was older than they were in the book.
Right. I remember you talking about that in another interview. Yeah, it's like you're their age.
Yeah. So what would I do in this impossible situation? What were their options? What were their lack of resources, the resources that were available to them? And to this young, ambitious and couple that first and foremost was in love with America and the idea of American dream and wanted to provide for their daughter, but had very little resources to do so. So I think that in revisiting my parents in this book, it freed me up to see them as they are now, who again are different people. They have grown since. And it's really freed us. A lot of people ask, how are my parents and I doing after the book? It's really freed the three of us up from the prisons of these years, which we never talked about, to start talking about the shame and the misunderstandings and miscommunications and the forgiveness and love that undergirded all of it, and free us to move forward and relate to each other as who we are now. We're certainly informed by those years, but we are not just of those years.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. What a gift to reach the place at the relationship with your parents where you can connect to them as adults, right? Not all of us get to that level. And to see how writing and storytelling really allowed that to be. Yeah. And, so many places that I wanted to go to, because I think particularly too about the way you write about your mother and your experiences working in all of these many, like you were saying, sort of manual labor, incredibly difficult situations. And I think to me those were some of the sort of most emotional moments of the book, and you're also able to then give us these glimmers of portraits into the people that you were working alongside. And in doing so, give us this much bigger world of people who are working in places that a lot of us don't see, right? And so what were you hoping to communicate by sort of including these portraits of the people that you and your mother were working alongside? I think those are some of the images that really stick with me in reading the book.
They're all around us. They make our world run. They're the people delivering our food. They're the people serving our food, cooking our food. I really wanted to give some voice to these invisible, but also very visible, if you look, of our country, who are just here with the same dreams and goals as the next person, but by virtue of luck and status have been relegated to a place where few people look. But when I order Chinese food delivery, I still feel that kind of dualism of I could have just as easily been you, and you could have just as easily been me, but for the grace of God and privilege. And I hold that in me as I walk around the world, and I do that not because I'm a martyr, but because I think it makes my experience richer to see the humanity in every single crevice of the day. I mean, our city is populated by undocumented workers who are not paid nearly enough and don't get nearly the respect or attention or protection that they deserve. And without them, half the city would be shut down. So I encourage everyone, I'm sure you encounter them, you may not know it, to kind of look a little bit more closely at the people who, I hesitate to use a word, but serve us, but they are not our servants, right? They are our equals.
Yeah, and I think, right, being able to see through your eyes the people who are working alongside you, their humanity, right, that you give us that window and that sort of invitation to see those people in our own worlds, right, through your seeing them in your childhood. Yeah. I mean, and right, I mean, you your book looks at this rarely talked about experience of undocumented children, where now we have so many students, children in New York City now who are undocumented. And you speak at schools all over. You were just telling me about going to speak at Stuyvesant. You go back to speak at your elementary school too, right? PS 124. So, I mean, what messages do you share with young people? What kind of do you get back from young people about your work?
I mean, whenever I meet young people, I look for them to teach me, because they're so much more ahead than, I don't know, how we were raised. They understand the sense of privilege, the sense of, systems of oppression so much earlier than I ever did. So I really look to them for inspiration. But almost every event, someone kind of quietly lingers and then comes up to me and says, like, my family's in that situation too. I also live this way. How do I get out? How do I get to law school? Like all of that. They tend to be very practically minded and focused. And I say, take care of your heart. Your heart. You cannot do work if your heart is not healed. And be gentle with yourself. Everything that you are feeling, someone out there is also feeling. Everything you are doubting about yourself, everyone else carries that doubt. It is not your fault. None of what you are dealing with today is your fault. It is your circumstance, but circumstances can change. Think of it as being temporary. And I hope that for all the undocumented people, that it is temporary. But I say that with privilege, because a lot of us have no pathway out. I was deeply fortunate. Most of the undocumented writers that I know are now formally undocumented, and that's what allows us to speak up. Because when you are still in that space, it is simply not safe. And so I feel very much a duty to speak out what those people cannot say, even in the dark of night. And yeah, I tell these kids that this experience does not define you. Who you are is innate, your worth is innate, and all of this is just circumstance that you will outgrow and you will reclaim.
Yeah, right. And just thinking, how crucial that message is to hear for young people today. And yeah, it makes me think too about just for young people who are, or people of any age who are undocumented, right, of how to think about sharing stories, and if there is a safe way to share stories, right? How do we, as a society, or as a museum, right? How do we cultivate space where people can share parts of their experience in ways that they feel comfortable and safe doing? So that we can learn, right? So that we can understand what are, who are the yous of today, age 7, age 10, right? And how can seeing the stories of families in the past and, people who were undocumented in the past, how can that shine light and create space for people to share now? So you also, you write a lot about your years in school and your teachers. And actually, oh my goodness, the sort of way you talked about your relationship with, was it Mrs. Pong, the teacher, and you stayed in touch with her, right?
I reconnected with her after my book came out. Oh. Yeah. So she seemed so old to me back then. Not old, but grown. She was only
just talking about that the other day, where you're like, our teachers were like 24, 25, and they seemed like ancient.
Yeah, she was 24. So I was like, that was like your first year teaching. You had all the authority in the world to me, and now she, has kids of her own, and she really is grown, and to the extent any of us are grown. And it's she kept these ridiculous cards that I made her. She showed me, like, after 30 years, it was like riddles that make no sense. Like, what do you call a witch on the beach? A sandwich. Like... And I was like, I don't remember that's pretty good. I'm going to plagiarize from my former self. She kept all of these things from me. And speaking of making safe, she saw me. Like, she told me she knew that something was going on that she wasn't privy to. That was not her business. It was her business to make me feel like I could have a voice in her class and embrace a talent that I have, which was writing. So she encouraged it by giving me books and encouraging me to write stories. And I wrote mostly fictional stories because I didn't feel safe to tell the real ones. But from her, I had this love of books and writing that has carried me my whole life. I would not be here today without her. I mean, public school teachers are true heroes. Speaking of the unsung and the invisible, I mean, they are our front line on so much. They shouldn't be, but they are. And I have so many of those angels who guarded and guided me on my path. I would not be here without any of them.
Yeah, and I feel like the event we did last week too, we ended up like shouting out public school teachers. So I feel like that's a hallmark of Tenement Museum conversations too, is to just give love to all the public school teachers who are, supporting our young people. And I mean, curious to get into some conversation about kind of your reflection on America and how you learned about, we get all these like glimmers in the book as, how young you is learning about New York City, is learning about the United States. How did sort of books play a role in you coming to understand this country?
Well, I think the very first thing I had to learn was that New York City is not the country. It's very easy for us to forget that. I still forget that every day. But I would read these books, like going back to Sweet Valley and Babysitter's Club, like people had lawns and they had one school and everyone went there. It was just very confusing. And I would see it on TV and be like, okay, so this America is completely different from the America that I live in, but I have no access to that one. And they largely don't have access to us. And I think therein lies the problem of a lot of what our country deals with. If only we could all be closer neighbors, I think we would love each other more. There was that. And then there was learning about this idea of law and lawyers. To me, being a lawyer seemed like the complete opposite of being undocumented, because you could stand up in court and speak and say the stories that you have to hide and bury as an undocumented person. You have access to resources. You know how the pipeline works if you ever want to become legalized. So to me, being a lawyer was kind of the height of American life. And I started reading biographies of jurists and judges. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg was one of the first, and Justice Thurgood Marshall. And I remember there was a particular emphasis in the Chatham Square Library, my home branch in Chinatown, of lawyers of color and women lawyers, such to a point where I would watch TV and be like, why are all the lawyers white men?
Right, you're like, that's
so inaccurate.
Which also, shout out librarians too, right? Of them like curating this selection for you.
Yeah, I'm confused. Again, the America I see here is not the one I see here. But I believe that because of what I'm seeing on the shelves, that I too can be a lawyer. It was, again, like as with debuting with a memoir, I think a little bit of ignorance was helpful to know, the actual odds stacked against me were pretty steep. But yeah, that was the public libraries were my very beginning to wrangle with this country, its system of laws, and the access and the gatekeepers who hold the keys.
Yeah, absolutely. That then, shapes the way that you've talked about the American dream, right? And how, how to kind of complicate and invite people to question, what do we think of as the American dream? Who has access to it? Wondering sort of where you are in thinking about this idea of the American dream now.
I think about it all the time.
Big question. And we probably are all thinking about this a lot.
Yeah.
But it's something, that on really all of our tours, we sort of invite our visitors into, like, what did the American dream mean at these different moments? How are people defining it and redefining it for themselves?
Yeah, we just announced today Penguin Random House is reprinting the Alien and Sedition Acts, which includes the Alien Enemies Act that Trump has been using recently to support his deportations. And they invited me to write an introduction, putting into context present day, past day, where we go from here. Present day I had past darkness was fine. Where we go from here took me, I was ripping my hair out. I'm like, I need to find some hope, some guidance. I was up, several nights trying to figure it out. And I think what I ultimately came up with was, it's easy to think, so the Alien and Sedition Acts came out just about 10 years after we created the Constitution, that we ratified the Constitution. It's very easy to think that when we formed the Declaration of Independence and Constitution, everything was rosy. We had this, city on a hill of democracy and things were peachy keen. That's never really been the case. We have this vision of America kind of held up for us and for the world. And I'm not mad at that vision because thing to aim for. It makes me angry how far we are from it and how we use that to actually enact oppression and alienation. And so I think what the American dream does is it calls on each and every one of us here to be liberty and justice's jealous guards. Jefferson actually said this when he was fighting the Alien and Sedition Acts, because it gives the president pretty much unilateral, unchecked power. We have to be jealous guards. Democracy does not function on contentment. We have to know that democracy is shaky at all times, and we have to be the check and the balance for the government. So any room where we're engaging in this kind of active dialogue, really hearing each other and engaging in this expression of what we believe to be freedom of speech, right? What each of us hold dear. Why are we here? What is our vision for America? How can we all jointly come together to bring us just a little bit closer? Because I don't think we're ever gonna get to that city on the hill, but we can move ourselves a little bit closer, an inch at a time. And sometimes we might fall back 10 inches. Sometimes that's necessary for us to keep going forward. So for me, the American dream is now an aim, not a destination. It's a vision beyond the horizon. And for me, it's any time that we show up authentically continuing to engage in this difficult discourse where we don't always agree, but we vow to hold true to the basic foundations of what we claim are this country, which is equality and justice and access and liberty, and the understanding that so long as one of us is oppressed, none of us are actually free.
Certainly. Yeah. And I think, right, the reframing from a destination, right, which is so often still, I think, how that myth tends to be told of like the American dream as a place that you can reach, instead thinking about it as a process and a call to action for each of us. I mean, just thinking about, we've been talking a lot about like what is democracy, especially for people who can't vote, right? And that there have been different moments in time in American history where who can and can't vote has looked different, but the idea of showing up for each other and hearing each other's stories and organizing and being together in spaces, how that is democracy, right? And working through the difficult parts. And I find some hope in that, right? In thinking about it as a process and as a continuous project of trying to connect to each other.
I think the idea is that democracy is supposed to be messy. If it's not messy, we're not allowing multiple voices. Right? So it's not, a dictatorship is very clean, it's very efficient. That's not what we're going for. So to give myself hope as much as the next person, when we're in the throes of the most recent mess, I'm saying this is just the swing of the pendulum. This is us engaging in forming the democracy that we have envisioned.
Yeah, and messy, right? History is messy too. Right? Trying to understand the past and untangle, the sort of different perspectives of people in the past, and how do we use then what we learn about the past to fuel us in the messy work of moving through democracy today? And that's hard, right? Mess is hard. I feel like that we need to mess, right? And to be able to work through it. So I did also want to, because we're here, towards the end of both Jewish American Heritage Month and, Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and wanted to take a moment, right? You're, both Asian American and Jewish American, and wanted to take a moment just for you to have some space to sort of reflect on that, and whether it's sort of what role Judaism has had in your life, or sort of how you think about what it means that both of these heritage months happen in the same month, and that these communities have overlapped in New York City for so many generations. I don't have a good question there.
Yeah,
but
no, I got you.
Take it from here.
I don't need a question. I'm good. I think there are a lot of similarities that get missed. I have a friend who says, like, I'm just a walking bag of generational trauma. 'Cause on one hand, I have the Holocaust, and on the other hand, I have the Cultural Revolution. I don't know which generational trauma is acting up. And I think I see a lot of similarities in the respective communities, the Chinese American and Jewish American communities, where we have so much opportunity to stand up to oppression. We have so much particular resources because of where we respectively have been through. But that gets mired in the depths of unhealed trauma that kind of follow and bring down both communities. And I think a lot about this with my work as a memoirist and author. I think a lot of memoirists get stuck in the times that they're writing in. So they're like, I'm just a little guy. Poor me. I'm the victim. I have no power. And it's hard when you meet an author who's well-known and respected and has a bigger platform than any other person could ever hope to have. And they're like, oh, woe is me. I'm just a little guy. There's a dissonance. That dissonance is inside me. And when I am activated or triggered and not coming from a place of power, it's that little guy who's like, I'm the victim. You have to protect me. And when I am living in my fullest potential as opponent of oppressor, as lawyer, as author, giving voice to stories that aren't heard, it is recognition that I now do have power. And we spoke about therapy earlier. I think there's a huge danger in being stuck in the victim mentality. I think every one of us here, by virtue of being here, has the power within our respective circles to speak up to whatever wrongs you see in current affairs, whether that is what is happening at home and whether that is what is happening abroad. You are not a victim if you refuse to be. You can hold your pains and your scars up to the light, right? You can acknowledge that my parents died in the Cultural Revolution. My grandparents suffered in the Cultural Revolution. My ancestors died in the Holocaust. But recognize your power in present day, that you are not kind of living in that kind of survivor mentality and situation, that by virtue of being in a different space and time, you have a responsibility to live up to what those ancestors may call upon you to do, which is usually to speak up against those holding the reins of power.
Yeah, right? I think crucial to consider, right? What do our ancestors call upon us to do, and how do we move forward with that? Yeah, absolutely.